Hi everyone, for my final project, I will be translating part of Qingwen qimeng, and this is a Manchu language textbook that was produced in 1730, and it was one of the most widely spread and used Manchu language textbook in the Qing dynasty. And it has a lot of variations, but usually it has 4 chapters, and what I translated was basically part of the chapter where there are a lot of daily conversations. So I can briefly show you how the book looked like. So it has like a 重排本. So 重排本will be closer to original text, like Chinese besides the Manchu text. However, it also has a transcribed text. So this part, it has the Latin letters that's Manchu transcribed, and then the Chinese after it. So what I basically did was I took part of this conversation and I translated based on the transcribed text because that will make my life easier for the sake of this project. But when you're translating actually from like rare book or like earlier book, or like for example just this book per se, you're gonna have a lot of difficulties along the way that you probably never thought of, because that's what I did for my last semester's Manchu language and history class final projects. But anyways, I selected part of that conversation, which is, it has over 100 conversations in that certain chapter, and I chose chapter 41. It's a rather long chapter, to be honest, and in this chapter, actually conversation, this section is like this much, and it's basically one speaker asking about another speaker's personal information, like for example the family name, the relatives, as well as the skills like archery and reading books. So so that the speaker could refer him to some certain like positions. So I chose this because I think it's really informative. It covers a lot of aspects that you might run into if you're studying Betterment history. And I'm primarily interested in social and cultural history of late imperial and modern China. So I think this is a great thing to translate. So for the sake of this project, I would be focusing more on the translational practice rather than this this content itself. But it definitely could be used to explore Bannerman history because there are a lot of useful information in it. And then the English translation that I used, let me make it bigger. The English translation that I used is this one by Alexander Wiley. I don't know if I pronounced it correctly, but this is actually written in not sure where it shows that, but it's written in 1855. So it's about 80 years after the original Qingwen qimeng. And here I am writing about 200 years later than this English translation. So I think it's useful to give a little background about this English translation. So this translation only has 2 pages of the author explaining like his purpose and such. So he actually, I think, used this translation to use this, like he primarily wanted to translate this to help the Jesuits to understand the Qing dynasty, the Qing society a little bit better so that they could pursue with their religious purposes. So it could also be related to, learning the language per se, because after all, this is a Manchu language textbook. And his practice, he doesn't really explain what his principle of translation are, but he does mention that he hoped to be like as uniform like he hopes to have obtained near to as uniform a mode of spelling as the English alphabet will admit of. So he's trying to make it more make more sense for the English native speakers, which is his audience. And he doesn't really say, but I translated based on this other principles. So it's really for me to explore, and I really enjoyed it. So this is a little background about this translation. And I can share a little more observation that I have made so far. At first, the third sentence of this section is basically Hontoho nung, I don't know how to pronounce Manchu, honestly. But this one, okay, this one that I highlighted. So, maybe the book will show better. Let me do it again. Okay. Here, this one. Okay, as you can see, the Chinese translation is basically transliteration. So, for example, here, 牛鹿, it would be 泥路 will be 牛路, and then 红头河 will be 浑脱河. So this is a transliteration, and it makes some sense given that this Manchu language textbook is like composed by Manchu native speakers, and they're just using transliteration for the Chinese translation. And my translation actually translated the Hongtoho as half squadron and 牛路 as squadron, because I was adopting the translation in this book, the banners and green flag. So in this book, it really gives some basic information about the bannerman. I forgot which page it was on, but it was in my paper. So it talks about 牛路 and what it is, and so it gives the translation as squadron. And at the same time, Wiley's translation is even more straightforward. So he translated it as a household or a field captaincy. So you could already see how more straightforward it would be, because you still have to understand what half squadron is, because it's not the most straightforward. And maybe it's because he has lived in that period. He probably had a much better idea of what the terms meant in that historical context, and he could translate more based on the real life meaning rather than the literal meaning. So this is something that I find really interesting, since I'm translating about 300 years after the original text. There are some advantage that Wiley has, given that he's living in that period. And the next one, I think, next observation that I find very interesting is that the section next to that one, they're talking about, so which captain and what name, what family name, whose descendant, how many, how old, age. However, so I would be assuming that this is asking the speaker, how old is he, and what's his family name, right? But the Wiley's translation translated as more like it's asking about the captain. So to what captain? To Changshou captain. What surname? Surname Chou. What name? His name is Feng Shengge. Whose son? He is the son of Shui 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 Hu Hu Hu. And how old is he? He is 19 years old. So this relates to the Manchu language itself, because it doesn't really possess any conjugations to show the persons, like it does in Spanish, French, and a lot of other languages. So it really relies very heavily on the context to determine who the people are talked about. And the original Chinese translation also respects this aspect of the Manchu language and translate it without specifying people. And that's what I did with my English translation. But Wiley's translation has some of his own interpretation of the context, as we can see. And he also adds he that did not appear to the original Manchu language. And actually, when we're thinking about the whole context, the speakers are talking about the captain before this part of the conversation, but the whole section is basically one speaker asking about another speaker, so that he could refer him to a different position for a position. In that case, the conversation should revolve around the responder, right? And later, this former speaker also asked about the other speaker's brothers and their birth dates, and it would make more sense if that speaker also asked about the responders. So I don't think Wiley's translation practice is the most effective or makes the most sense in this case. So I really prefer my translation practice and the original Chinese translation. And bear in mind that this is a Manchu language textbook. I want to be as closely aligned with the original text as possible and translate the grammar as it is, translate the words as it is. Of course, that would create some problem for the non-Manchu language native speakers. So for example, the English translation would sound a little weird. I will add a bracket. So like out of the bracket, I would translate it based on the words, based on the grammar. And in the bracket, I would provide a more consistent or more a better translation in the language that I'm translating in. So this is my practice basically. And the next observation that I have made is I don't think it's Wiley's problem per se, because Manchu language documents, sometimes they don't have the best periods, commas, question marks, and sometimes it relies heavily on the conjugation to show that this is a question. So at 4126 here this one. So me, and because I'm translating based on this transcribed text, I also assume that this is a statement responding to the previous question, saying, oh, my younger brother is 6 years old, he's still young. Why this translation, like, he has the transcribed text as a question, which I'm not sure whether that's a original text problem or his interpretation of it. So he translated as, what age is your younger brother? Is he 6 years or less? So it doesn't really have any interrogation verb forms to indicate that this is a question. I also think it would make more sense if this is an answer to the previous question, because the flow will make the most sense. If I translate it as the way that I translate, it would be the first speaker asking, how old is your younger brother? The second speaker say, he just passed 6 years old, he is still young, and then the first speaker say, oh, when is his birthday? So it's like A, B, A. While if you translate as Wiley's way, it would be A all along, asking 3 questions at the same time. So what age is your younger brother? Is he 6 years or less? When is his birthday? So it's 3 questions asked at the same time. It doesn't make the most sense. It doesn't really appear elsewhere in this whole conversation. So I'm assuming this is an error to translate it as the first speaker's question. So it would be the statement. So after all, I think I'm trying to stay really true to the original Manchu text, grammar, meaning, and it would be very difficult because sometimes I am respecting the Manchu words and sentences, while it would look weird in English language or other languages I'm translating in. At the same time, sometimes even if I'm translating based on the meaning, it doesn't look, it's not like 100% intuitive. So Wiley did a good job and translating Niulu as field captaincy, while I translated as squadron, which is not the most straightforward either. So I basically I tried to try my best to keep the order consistent as well. So the sentences would look very weird because we all know even in like English and Chinese it would be different orders when we say a certain sentence. So it might not be the best thing for the readers to read, but it would serve a purpose if you're using this translation to learn Manchu language. There are a lot of things I need to balance, and I'm curious to see what other discrepancies my translation and Wiley's translation have. And the content, again, I think is worth exploring, and I hope that this translation could serve a purpose for further exploring Bannerman history. So yeah, this is basically my final project.